Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Clinton Presidential Center for this special keynote evening program of the 2014 Presidential Sites and Libraries Conference. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor this evening, the Little Rock Convention and Visitors Bureau. The LRCVB is charged with promoting all this great city has to offer, and they have been terrific partners to the Clinton Center since our groundbreaking so many years ago. I'd especially like to thank the LRCVB Executive Director, Gretchen Hall, who is one of Little Rock's greatest resources and one of the Clinton Center's greatest champions. Gretchen, thank you so much for everything you do for us. I'd also like to recognize the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historic Park for sponsoring our reception in 42 beforehand. Please join me in thanking our wonderful sponsors. Well, I am very pleased to have the honor of introducing tonight's keynote speaker. I've had the privilege of working with President Clinton for almost 23 years. He is a thoughtful leader and a devoted public servant, and I could go on and on about his accomplishments. But what has personally inspired me the most, particularly in the last decade, is what he has done and continues to do for Arkansas, a state we both call home. President Clinton chose to build his presidential center in Little Rock for many reasons, but I would like to share with you the two reasons that resonate with me the most. First, he wanted the Clinton Center to be in the middle of the country where more people would have access to it, and we see this every day. School children who may not have the opportunity to see the Emancipation Proclamation, or meet an ambassador or a Secretary of State, or even a former president can experience these once-in-a-lifetime opportunities and more right here on the banks of the Arkansas River. The second reason is, and I've heard him say this many times, is that he would have never been president without the support of the people of Arkansas. The Clinton Center has been and continues to be a tremendous gift to this community and to this state. And in fact, since 1997, when President Clinton announced this as the site for his presidential center, more than $3 billion has been invested in downtown Little Rock alone. It has been a catalyst for economic development for our state. President Clinton believed that this center could be more than just a place to reflect upon his time in the White House, but it could be a place where people could come together to learn about the history of their country and the world and be inspired to public service. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome the founder of the Clinton Foundation and the 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. When Stephanie was saying that she'd worked for me in one capacity or another for 23 years, I was thinking, oh good, that means the statute of limitation is run and I can't be prosecuted for violating the child labor laws. When I hired her, I want to thank her, Terry Garner, for her wonderful work here at our library. Bruce Lindsay, the chairman of our foundation. I have many friends in this audience, but I can't not acknowledge my longtime colleague as a governor, Governor Jerry Baliles from Virginia, now at the Miller Center, which is taking all our oral histories. And, you know, I just can't wait to see what some of these people said about me. Tomorrow you're going to Central High, and I thank my longtime friends, Ernie Green and Carlotta Walls-Lanier, who came all the way from Denver to be with us, to be part of your tour. Their story more than 50 years ago, and their story today is an important part of who we are here in this state and how things have turned out for us. I want to thank all of you who are in any way involved in these presidential libraries. The theme of this conference is historical context and modern relevance. And so I just want to offer a few observations about this. First of all, I worked really hard on this library. My architect said I was the single worst client he'd ever had. He said that we started working on the plans, before I left the White House, and he came in once and I hadn't met him in 6 months. And he changed one thing in the library, and I said, "Why did you change that?" He said, "I hadn't been here in 6 months. How'd you notice that?" I said, "Unlike you, I had to spend the rest of my life there." I think they're really important. And so I thank all of you for doing what you do. What I wanted to do with the library and with the establishment of America's first graduate school of public service as opposed to public policy, and I thank Skip Rutherford, our dean who's here, and all the people who are involved in that, was to convince people who came here, without regard to their background, their income, their politics, whether they voted for me or voted against me, that they shouldn't sit on the sideline because it actually matters, that active citizenship is important. One of the most interesting political battles playing out in America today is the direct result of sporadic citizenship. That is, America looks a lot different than it does when I was elected almost 22 years ago now. It's more female, it's younger, it's less white, but there are more older people in the voting age, even though there are more younger people in school, even than there were in the baby boom generation. And two different Americas show up in the presidential years and then in the off years. So you have this titanic battle going on in Washington where the Democrats would like to expand voter participation, make it easier to vote, and we should be honest, even though we believe on the merits in immigration reform, and there was a study just this week, that said that in the communities in America that have accepted a lot of immigrants, the wage growth of non-immigrants is twice as high as it is in the communities without immigrants. So we believe it, but we also think it'd help our side by making America even more diverse. I was trying to figure out the other day what the vote would have been in 1992 and 1996 if America had looked as it did in 2008 and 2012. On the other hand, of the more than 120 million people in America that regularly vote in presidential elections, 49 million of them regularly don't vote in the midterm elections. So that explains a lot of the efforts in state legislators and by governors who are mostly elected in the off-year election to increase the difficulties, the threshold of the franchise. So you have this crazy situation where one party is trying to make the off-year elections look more like the presidential electorate, and one party wants the presidential electorate to look a little more like the off-year electorate, when what we ought to be doing is every one of us trying to appeal to everybody to figure out how we can develop some sort of national consensus. I just met with my interns, the summer intern crop here, and one of them asked me, he said, when you passed welfare reform and there was a Republican Congress, and majorities of both parties in both houses voted for it, the final version. How did it happen? And I said, well, it's a little more complicated than that, but basically what you need to know is that the leadership in both parties actually wanted something to happen. That both parties thought they were hired to show up and get something done. So of the modern relevance, I'm going to go back to the historical significance. The modern relevance is that we have to create the conditions again in which the internal driving energy is for action on the critical challenges facing the country. And then we have to figure out a willingness to have inclusive decision-making processes, which means you can't always get what you want. Everybody has forgotten that our founding fathers that we tend to deify were actually deal makers. And they set us a system that requires deal making. And otherwise, we'd be a parliamentary system. We could do whatever the heck we wanted when we were in. When we were out, we could say whatever we wanted because it would have no consequence. We were expected to row in the same boat. Now, that's relevant to today, whatever you think, however you think we should resolve any of these issues. I also think it is quite important that these libraries are repositories of history. And while I think, for example, ours succeeds, and I think it'd be hard to walk through there and pay half attention to what you see and believe it doesn't matter who wins and what decisions they make. And that was my number one goal. But there's not enough space in any of those little enclaves upstairs to tell the whole story about what happened on any issue. How did we pass the national service legislation, for example? Something will be, we're observing the 20th anniversary of this year. That requires more. So what we've tried more and more to do is to emphasize, the anniversaries of things, the 15th anniversary, the 20th anniversary, whatever. The most important one of these that I have seen any of you do recently was the conference put on by the LBJ Library for the 50th anniversary of President Johnson's signing of the Civil Rights Act, and beginning a year which will end with the 50th anniversary of his signing of the Voting Rights Act. Both of those landmark pieces of legislation illustrates that in our system, every significant outcome is the product of politics, policy, and the personality of our leaders, and how they mix or don't at any given time in history. It's important that people understand that. It's important that children be raised to believe that what they do makes a difference, and that they can't get discouraged when they get their brains beat out. And they can't complain when the predictable adverse consequences flow from doing something that needs to be done that's still going to make a lot of people mad. It's important to understand you need mechanisms that deal with the foreseen as well as the unforeseen consequences of all changes. I put out a statement last night on the EPA proposal to limit carbon emissions from power plants. And I endorsed it because I believe climate change is real. I think the consequences are already terrible. I think they're going to get worse. And I believe there are economically viable ways to make this transition. On one sunny day 2 weeks ago in Germany, for the first time since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the most powerful economy in Europe generated 74% of its electricity from the sun and the wind. Now, it cost them a lot of money, yes, but now most of the electrical generating capacity in Germany is in the hands not of centralized companies, but of communities and cooperatives of farmers. And Deutsche Bank, not some radical think tank, Deutsche Bank, says that they have netted 300,000 jobs, notwithstanding the extra cost. Now, why is that? The Germans take great care with the details. So when we go into this transformation on assuming the courts uphold what the EPA has done to reduce carbon emissions over the next several years, it is designed, the proposal, to let states fashion their own responses. The one thing the proposal can't do, because it's not the EPA's job, that is terribly important, is to recognize that there will be more winners and losers, but there will be losers. That is the argument that the opponents say is there'll be more losers than winners. I don't buy that. It's never happened yet. Ever since President Nixon set up the EPA, every time we had an advance in environmental or public health, there have been people saying that the economic costs are greater than the public health or environmental benefits. So far, that hadn't been true. So far, we found clever ways to do it, spawned all kinds of new energy, new industries and new technologies, and basically reorganized ways of doing business. But that is not to say there won't be losers. And what I tried to say in this blog is, if you focus on people as well as policy and politics, you have to recognize that people in coal country and east of the Mississippi are already in trouble. In West Virginia and Ohio and Kentucky, a few left in southwest Pennsylvania. Those people didn't do anything wrong. And the economy's been passing them by for decades. Somebody ought to do something to make sure that the transition brings investment, not just for training, because it doesn't do you any good to get trained for a job that's the nearest one's 300 or 400 miles away. But actually, if you have distributed power, which is essentially what solar and wind and efficiency, building efficiency and other things are, that's distributed power, then by definition you should be able to have distributed employment. And somebody needs to be working on that so that, all of us don't feel piously self-righteous 5 years from now and the unemployment rate's still where it is today in some of these places or worse. That's not right. And we got to get better at this. As a country, we've got to get better at this. But the point is, we can learn a lot. One of the things I believe we did a good job of was the move to reduce tobacco production in America in the face of the public health evidence that it was in trouble. But the tobacco farmers hadn't done anything wrong. They did what their people had been doing for centuries. And so we put together a package which, according to Tina Flournoy, my chief of staff, who just told me it was up in some article that she found on the internet today, who talked about how it financed the transition for those tobacco farmers from Kentucky and Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia, so that they wouldn't be adversely affected by this change. In a world where change is occurring, somebody once told me that Russell Long, when he was head of the Senate Finance Committee, and people would bring him proposed tax changes, said that every one of them was an example of a law he had learned, which was, let's change, you go first. And so I think this is going to be an interesting time for us. And there are some of these currents running through the world that cannot and be reversed, and we have to figure out whether it's going to change will be our friend or our adversary. One of the major determinants is whether we can spread the benefits more broadly. And the absence of that today is a real problem. So anyway, that brings me back to this LBJ exhibit. And what they were able to do at the Johnson Library was to go in some greater detail than they would otherwise have been able to do for somebody just touring on a normal day, to understand, what the challenges were, how the president got Republican support without which he could never have passed that bill, and why they supported it, how it worked out, how we move forward. Every presidential library both has an historical mission and an obligation to try, and come on, they all think the person they represent did a pretty good job or they wouldn't be working there. But that's not the point. The point is that we should be making honest efforts to show what the relevance was to the current day. So, for example, when I served, by the time I became president, I had already been involved with two presidents, believe it or not, that you would think had nothing in common, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, in welfare reform. President Carter gave 5 states waivers from the federal welfare rules to let us set up more work-based systems, and I asked them to make Arkansas one of the 5, and they did. The Reagan White House wanted to make a serious effort to improve the welfare system in '87 and '88, and I got to represent the Democratic governors in a bipartisan effort to do that with an overwhelmingly Democratic House of Representatives. And I remember being carried away when I was invited to the bill signing when President Reagan signed the bill in 1988. It did a lot of good. We have to find ways again for everybody to want to make something happen. I got asked by one of the interns today whether something about immigration reform. I said it will happen when both sides want something to happen, not when they agree, when they want something to happen. We went through 2 vetoes and endless rewrites of the welfare reform bill, and finally we got to something that both sides thought was imperfect, but way better than leaving things the way they were. And in the first little mini recession, when the tech bubble burst in early 2001, people who moved from welfare to work were actually slightly less likely to be laid off than the general population. And those things are important for people to know, not so they'll think more or less of the past president, but so they will gain some insight into how these challenges we face today, which are different, can be approached in ways more likely to produce a positive result. All of us have an interest in that. None of us want America to fail. And if you're honest and you work at any presidential library, you have to say, no matter how much you think of your president, none of us are right all the time. For example, one thing nobody foresaw in this welfare reform debate, people started flailing away at me for allowing the states to set the benefit levels. And I said, and I found that 90% of the progressives who were attacking me did not know that there was, in effect, no federal standard of benefits. The law in 1994, 95, and 96, when we finally got the bill passed, the law was that the monthly benefits could not be lower than they were in 1973. And I found almost nobody knew it. So, for example, in Vermont, you got $650-something for a family of 3 per month. But in Mississippi and Texas, you got $183. And everybody, so that doesn't sound like much of a national standard for me. However, I did not anticipate the combination of the fiscal squeeze on the states from the financial meltdown and the ideological squeeze on them, so that actually some states have eliminated all cash assistance to poor people. I got to fess up, I never thought that would happen. I didn't think anybody'd have the whatever to take $183 a month away from people who didn't have any money and had kids in the house. So that's one that nobody thought would happen. We learn all these things as we go along. The context in which we made the decisions is important. That's another thing. I suppose one of the reasons my presidency has remained relevant to critics in both parties is that I have a spouse who seems to remain relevant. and that's fine with me. It's a poor price to pay for that. I love it. But it is important to try, insofar as we possibly can, to give people the context in which these decisions were made. For example, when President Reagan took office and we'd been through all this stagflation, and he was a wonderful rock storyteller, and he convinced us that government would mess up a two-car parade. There was a lot of evidence for that in what had happened. We weren't doing very well. Even though we were creating jobs like crazy, the inflation was hurting us. But we had never before basically had a big tax cut and willfully run deficits in peacetime. So within a couple of years, he actually signed a bill to claw back some of those things. People like me who were more fiscally conservative didn't think it was enough, but at least it was something that showed that there was some play there where they were trying to work together. And you got to give people credit when they're willing to basically take on their own ideological core to try to get the country in a place where it's functioning again. And so you should remember that. All of you are doing this. The facts matter and the context matters. It's not enough just to know the facts. You have to know the context. What were the alternatives available at the time? Most of the people on my left who criticize me now pretend that I didn't have a Republican Congress for 6 years of my presidency, and that I was just a little dictator sitting alone in an office. And only if I just wanted this, that, or the other thing, poof, it would have happened. A guy said, I was talking to somebody the other day, said, you know, it's a terrible thing when you lowered capital gains tax from 28 to 20%. I said, you know what I got for it? He said, no. I said, the children's health insurance bill. Then 6 million kids getting health insurance. And so I said to this guy, whom I liked, we were friendly, I said, you're entitled to say I made a bad decision, but you're not entitled to tell one half of the decision without the other half. You're not entitled to ignore the role of the Congress in these decisions. And that's the kind of thing you can do. None of us should be blindly defensive of every decision that was made. None of us should fail to acknowledge that errors were made. But my experience is most people who become president are honest and do what they think is right. And they do their best to do what they think is right. And thank goodness most of them, faced with overwhelming circumstances different than they anticipated when they were running, turn into the changes instead of turning away from them. You may not agree with everything that second President Bush did after 9/11, and I don't, but it was far preferable to pretending it didn't happen, which is what destroyed the presidency of Nelson Mandela's successor in South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, a man I had affection and admiration for. I thought he probably knew more about economics than any African president we'd had in a very long time. And he ran thinking that he would create a modern economic state after Mandela had created a modern political state. And all of a sudden, boom, all these people start coming across the border from Zimbabwe and elsewhere, and he's got the biggest AIDS caseload in the world. And so they looked for ways to deny it, or to deny that there were any things they could do to deal with it, hoping he could just change the subject and go back to what he ran to do in the first place. That's a very poor strategy in the world of reality, where there are some things not subject to denial. So that's another thing. I think giving context to these decisions helps people try to seek out the context for today's decisions. Then I think it's important to acknowledge what's new and different, to give whoever's in a chance. For example, when I took office, the average cell phone weighed 5 pounds. There were 50 sites on the internet. The only email were inter-office memos, all of which were subpoenaed by the Congress when I was there. So I had 0. I didn't send any. I sent 2 emails when I was president, one to John Glenn in outer space to say, come home, because it was controversial. I had to give personal approval for a 77-year-old man to go in outer space, looking younger every day. And one to our troops on a ship in the Adriatic during the Kosovo conflict. But basically, all was snail mail. And when I left office, there were several million people then, tens of millions on the internet. Today, there are 3 billion people who have access to the internet. It's a very different world. I was really fortunate because I became president at the time when information technology was leaving Silicon Valley and Route 128 and the exchange companies in DC and the video game companies in Texas and spreading into every aspect of the American economy. So it was pretty clear to me that if you wanted to raise incomes and have broad-based prosperity, you had to have more jobs to tighten the labor market, and you had to change the job mix so that median wages would rise. So we just identified every pressure point we could possibly think of and put the pedal to the metal there and tried to accelerate it. And thank goodness it worked. Now, there are a lot of people who believe that the technological productivity gains of information technology are so great that it is no longer possible to spin out more jobs than disappear from increased productivity. I don't know the answer to that. But I don't think that the proposition has been fully tested. However, I think that all of us who are on the outside looking in owe a fair measure of humility and flexibility to the policymakers in the White House and in Congress and in the cabinet who are trying to come to grips with this. Nobody knows the answer to that now, I don't believe. I know what I'd try to do to find out, but I don't think you can be absolutely clear about it. I think one other thing I just wanted to say, most of us in this library business try to acknowledge what the political forces of the day were without being too harshly partisan. It's easier to do that when you're not running for anything. People say to me all the time, you know, how wonderful it is that I developed this incredible relationship with first President Bush and a good friendship with the second President Bush. But it's easier when you're not running for anything. And so while I think the presidents should continue to do things and their libraries should continue to do things which reach across the partisan divide, I think one of the things that we should do is also be honest enough to tell the American people that while we hope this is a good model and we hope it will spark more active bipartisan cooperation, we should be honest. It's easier when your own neck is not on the line, when you've run your last race, when your ambition's been slaked. Because I think it's easier for people to listen to you then. I worried that even more than when I was a child growing up here in the civil rights era, when there was so much rhetoric and pushing people apart, that all this money, all these interest groups, and the complexity of these issues are further alienating people from politics as policy. And in the confusion, what you're having, I think, is more and more people voting on politics as identity. I told somebody once, I'm not sure they believed me, and I'm not sure when I was still running I believed it myself, but I knew it was right, that I longed for the day when America would be united enough that no Democrat could get 90% of the African American vote, because there was an honest debate of ideas and approaches, and everybody was right on the core issues. I long for the day when that happened with first-generation immigrants. It seems to be happening now with the whole issue of gay rights. But it's easier when you're not running for anything to say all these things. And so I urge all of you to play up the generosity of the presidents living and dead that you honor by your work in their libraries. Because America, if it becomes only about identity-based politics, cannot possibly lead the world where it needs to go in the 21st century. Here's the only thing I really know for sure that's still relevant. Wherever people are working together with the aim of getting something done, good things are happening. And wherever people's primary operational mode is to fight and to emphasize our differences over our common humanity, good things are not happening. And I challenge you, look all over America, look all around the world, and you will find that. Let's take one of the most troubled areas of the world. How in the wide world has Lebanon survived? With the Hezbollah coming in and Iran and Syria having access to it, and I tell you why, they nearly destroyed themselves in the 70s. Sometimes they rocket Israel, sometimes Israel rockets them. They've been invaded. How in the world are they standing? Because they have a constitution that mandates shared decision-making, shared participation, and a memory of when identity politics almost took them off the face of the earth in the 70s. So the prime minister is a Sunni, then the Speaker of the Parliament must be a Shia, and the President must be a Maronite Christian, and the head of the Supreme Court must be a Druze. They are sharing the future. How is Jordan surviving? Jordan imports 96 or 97% of its energy, has the lowest amount of water per capita of any country on earth, was already a majority Palestinian country before the Egyptian refugees from the Arab Spring showed up, and now there are somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million Syrians there, and since only 10% of them are in camps, nobody really has a good number. How are they surviving? Because even with a monarchy, they tried to make it more and more constitutional, more and more political in the best sense, more and more sharing. If you look around America at the cities that have already surpassed their pre-crash economic conditions, without exception, they have very dense networks of cooperation. So I just leave you with that. All of us like to be known for what we did against all the odds. But in the end, we're not quite as different as we think we are. Human Genome Project's most important finding for you, as opposed to the scientists, is that with 3.6 billion genomes in our body, every non-age-related difference you can see in this room, including gender and race, is rooted in 0.5% of your genome. I sometimes think the world's biggest problem is we spend, every one of us, 99.5% of our time thinking about the 0.5% of us that's different. And I have promised I will do this till the end of the year. The most important political book I have read in the last 3 years was written not by a politician, not by a professor of politics, not by a historian, but by double Nobel Prize-winning microbiologist at the age of 87, E.O. Wilson. It's called The Social Conquest of Earth, in which Wilson, in about 250 pages, does his best with the available evidence to trace the history of all life on the planet from the emergence of single-celled organisms from the premortal slime. He's 90 now, and boy, he's still got it. I mean, his mind is on all cylinders. And he basically says, if you look at the history of all life on the planet, if you look at the extinction of the dinosaurs, the extinction of the giant mammals, the triumphant species have only one thing in common: the ones that have endured repeated attempts to kill them off. They are ants, termites, bees, and people. And they have only one thing in common. Of all the species that have ever lived, they are the most cooperative. And ants, termites, and bees did it without brains, as far as we know. They don't have any consciousness or conscience. They basically developed to do this. But the ants have done pretty well. The combined weight of all the ants on Earth is greater than the combined weight of all the people on Earth. And there are species of ants that literally, when being chased through forests by predators, sense when they're about to be caught, and a group of the ants will go up on the tallest sprigs of grass and sacrifice themselves so that the others may live. There are termites in hot climates that build their homes underground and drill 4 holes or 5 holes in the space above it, but they only go in and out of one. The others are simply for air conditioning. And when it's about to rain, they all stay out. They don't want to drown. How do they know that? How did that happen? The point is, if just one termite did it, the others would drown, and then the species would go extinct. And bees have survived any number of things, partly because of their highly sophisticated division of labor, without which we would find it hard to get the nourishment we need to survive as a species. And you should be worried, very worried about the declining population of bees now. It hasn't been totally reversed. And Wilson says, look, people are the most important because they have consciousness and conscience, but they have repeatedly toyed with their own destruction and then pulled away. And this guy said, I spent my whole life telling everybody the sky is falling. I've been an academic chicken and little. I've been griping about all these species disappearing from the earth at a more rapid rate than they have in thousands and thousands of years. But on balance, I'm pretty optimistic because every time we have a chance to destroy ourselves, we find a new way to cooperate. That's what you need to think about. In a funny way, every single presidential library represents the triumph of a democracy that is increasingly diverse, that has found a way to meet its common challenges, to resolve its deep differences, and to keep going forward. That's a story we all have to tell in some way or the other. We should value our differences. We should promote the debates. They're healthy. Nobody's right all the time. But in the end, we're all still here because when the chips are down, we thought what we had was in common was more important than what divided us. It's a lesson we still have to learn every single day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are so honored you could join us tonight. I can't even begin to imagine a more captive audience than presidential historians and librarians. Tonight marks the first time that a former president has attended a Presidential Sites and Libraries Conference. Therefore, on behalf of all the sites and the libraries represented tonight, we want to thank you for your words, We want to thank you for continuing to support the value of presidential history and the direct impact it has on our collective future. And thank you most of all for your leadership. That's from me. We ask that you remain seated while President Clinton departs, and I hope you enjoy your dinner, and Bob will be back later at the podium to give you the closing instructions, all your directions, and all the information that you need for buses, tours, and tomorrow's events. Thank you very much.